It's Wednesday, it's 11:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, Conservative MP Miriam Cates, Labour MP Siobhan McDonough, non-affiliated peer Claire Fox and Joe Grady, General Secretary of the University and Colleges Union. Today, breaking news in the last hour. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, the British Iranian woman held in Iran, is on her way home, according to her MP. Nazanin was detained nearly 6 years ago. She and another British-Iranian national are reportedly at the airport about to head back to the UK. We'll have the latest on that. Also today, Boris Johnson is in the Gulf as he tries to build international support against Vladimir Putin.
He's been able to blackmail the West to hold Western economies to ransom. We need independence.
But Labour says we're swapping one dictator for another. Meanwhile, the Russian assault on Kyiv continues, but is there new hope for peace? Also today, will we see an upsurge in industrial strife as the cost of living crisis bites? With the Prime Minister abroad, it will be Dominic Raab and Angela Rayner at the dispatch box at PMQ's at midday. Let's start with that breaking news in the last hour or so that the British-Iranian woman Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe has been released from Tehran and is at the airport, according to latest reports, and on her way home as soon as is possible. We can show you this tweet from her local MP who has spent years campaigning for her release, Tulip Siddiq. The Labour MP saying Nazanin is at the airport in Tehran and on her way home. I came into politics to make a difference, and right now I'm feeling like I have. More details to follow. #FreeNazanin. We've also had some reaction from her family, Nazanin's family, from her sister-in-law, Rebecca. Let's take a listen. I think that particular clip has frozen. We will try and bring it to you as quickly as possible, but let's get reaction from our panel. Miriam, first of all.
Well, if the reports are true, then I absolutely welcome them. And I think, as a mother, you know, many millions of mums around the country, the thought of being separated from your child for that long has just been tragic. So if it's true, it's very, very welcome news.
I'm completely delighted for her husband, Richard, and daughter, Gabrielle. I mean, what must it have been like over the last 6 years? And she's coming home, and what sort of condition will she be in when she comes? So...
Well, and the government this morning, Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, saying it was all really on a knife edge, talking also about an unpaid debt that was legitimate, an unpaid debt to Iran, and that the government was looking for ways to pay for it. But it does look as if this is a very positive development, Claire.
I think that the context of the grim situation in terms of, you know, Europe potentially on the brink of war, this is the kind of news that you really want, isn't it? What fantastic news if it happens. I think with this situation, I want her to be in the UK before quite popping the champagne, but absolutely brilliant.
Jo?
So I think, you know, as everyone says, she's lost 6 years of her life. When she was in prison, she was my age, she was 37. And I think I can't imagine what she's gone through. Her daughter's lost a mother for all that time. I think it's right. We need to wait until she's on home soil. But there needs to be serious questions about why it's taken so long to pay this debt, why it's taken so long to get her home. But I wish her well. I want to pay tribute to everyone who's helped get her home.
She isn't the only one. Another British-Iranian national, Anousheh Ashuri, is also said to be at the airport. There are two other people. We don't know the status of them. They had also been detained for a significant amount of time. We'll bring you any developments as they break throughout Politics Live today. But as we were saying in the headlines, the Prime Minister is in the Gulf ahead of a meeting with the Saudi government to build, as he calls it, an international coalition coalition against the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Prime Minister is looking to secure an increase in energy supplies from the region in a bid for the UK to wean itself off Russian oil and gas. This has been the response from the Labour leader Keir Starmer. A headline in The Guardian, which we can show you, which broadly says that actually the Prime Minister is swapping one dictator for another. Boris Johnson going from dictator to dictator for oil, says Keir Starmer. And Miriam, there is some truth in that, isn't it? He's making this trip less than a week after the Saudi regime executed 81 men in one day. Should he be going?
Well, the government is very concerned about the beheadings. You know, we oppose the death penalty in Saudi Arabia and in all countries around the world that use the death penalty.
But he's going there with a begging bowl.
But I think he's going there to build a global coalition against Vladimir Putin, and we have to be realistic about this. We have become dependent on Russian oil. So has as much of the rest of the Western world. What's the greatest threat to world peace right now? I think it's obvious. It's Vladimir Putin and his atrocious war in Ukraine. And I think geopolitics is not black and white, is it? You know, there are plenty of regimes, plenty of countries that we don't fully disagree with, but should we completely disengage? And I think on a case-by-case basis, we have to make that decision, isolate or disengage or engage. And at the moment, Putin is the #1 threat to world peace, and we should work with people against him.
Right, I mean, it's true, isn't it? Geopolitics isn't black and white, Siobhan.
No, absolutely not black and white. But what this does shows us that the government has been in power for the last 12 years. And where is our energy policy? About 7% of our oil and gas comes from Russia.
Well, it's less than that, actually. Yeah. I think it's about 4 or 5%.
I thought it was 7 and about 17 for diesel.
Well, it's much less than Europe.
Yeah, absolutely it is less. And we should have, in those 12 years, surely it would be the job of government to ensure that we were not dependent on any dictator or any difficult place to get our energy from. You know, what are we doing about onshore wind and solar power? What are we doing about new nuclear? And for me, perhaps a bit more controversially with people on my own side, I think we have to look at fracking because we need to be as independent as we can be.
Right,
so
have you changed your mind on fracking, or have you always believed that that was part of the solution on energy?
Yeah, I have always.
OK, just to go back to the issue of Boris Johnson actually going to the Gulf states, to Saudi Arabia. I mean, Keir Starmer has said he's going cap in hand from dictator to dictator, but he hasn't called for him not to go, has he?
No, but that sounds pretty much to me like he's opposing it. I just think, who are you going to get in bed with to get a small amount of your energy? Sort your own out.
Claire?
The problem has been, up until now, not that we had any relationship with Putin at all. In real politic terms, in terms of diplomacy and serious foreign policy, you're going to have to deal with dictators who you loathe and despise. That is the way things are. My problem with the way that we've dealt with Putin, for example, was that, indeed, we didn't take him seriously and that there was a mess up in terms of foreign affairs post the Cold War. Maybe NATO should have been disbanded altogether with a new force being built. I'm just making the point that it wasn't taken seriously. And so there was a prodding of the bear, but as though he was a teddy bear. So they never took him seriously, right? So the reason I'm saying that is because I actually do not think the issue is whether you engage with dictators or not, but the issue is how you deal with your relationships with those countries, how seriously you take foreign policy. And on the energy question, just very quickly, I do agree with you, actually, though, that we should not be outsourcing our energy needs anyway, because actually it's a bit like we've gone down this net zero thing, then we end up outsourcing the dirty work of getting the oil somewhere else, and actually we should be
we're sending some of our own oil somewhere else.
And I agree with you completely that we do need to relook at fracking. We do need to have a serious energy policy. So that bit we agree on. But I don't think that the issue is just that you talk to bad people.
All right. Well, do you want to say? I'm going to come to you, Jo, in just a second.
I think we have nothing in my life has ever said to me that you stand up to a bully by letting them get away with stuff.
And I never suggested for 1 minute
and we watched him. We watched him go into Chechnya. We watched him in Crimea. We watched him in Syria, and we did nothing. This is a consequence of our timidity in actually dealing with Putin.
To accept that, I promise you, Jo, I will continue.
Well, I agree with a lot of what Siobhan says, but I think this is a wake-up call to the West. It absolutely is, and it has united us in a way that has surprised me. But let's remember, the aggressor here is Vladimir Putin. He is the source of evil, and yes, we need to work out how to respond to this, and perhaps we could have done some things differently, but he is the one who's causing this crisis, and we need to be...
Well, hang on, I've got to get Jo... I mean, Jo, that point that Claire makes, do we have to deal with dictators? I mean, is that the sort of realpolitik of the world?
So a comment was made a few minutes ago that, you know, global politics isn't black or white, and I will return to that because it isn't. But the point here is there are other options available. You know, for people watching the show, my understanding is that Boris Johnson is going to the Middle East to try and negotiate to get oil prices to dip to deal with the cost of living.
Well, they want them to increase supplies, and that will bring the price down, and to get investment in green energy.
But we don't need Saudi money to renew our green energy in the UK. We have a further and adult education system that is primed to deliver. We could invest on our own without going and shaking hands with dictators who sign off executions. So I think that is the point, because for me, it isn't our reliance on dictators, it is our reliance on fossil fuels. There are many things we could do to transition to a better economy. But one thing I want to say as well is there are other options available to Johnson right now. He could go after fossil fuel companies. He could cap energy prices. There are a number of things that doesn't involve him going to Saudi.
Hang on, one at a time. Claire first, and then I'll come back.
Punishing oil companies or fossil fuel companies is not going to resolve the fuel crisis, which we have.
Workers who can't afford to pay their bills.
What is going to happen is that those workers will be punished if we haven't got the energy to run the universities, the workplaces, and so on and so forth. Ordinary working class people are going to pay for an obsession amongst some people.
Curbing shareholder profits will not exhaust
environmental energy options are limited as yet. Therefore, what we're talking about is that up until now, I'm saying up until now, we should have had a more sensible energy policy. In that sense, we agree on that. What I'm saying is that now, however, in this crisis, of course we need to get energy. I also think we should, however, restart fracking, do everything and anything to get energy working again. I said that.
All right. Yeah, no, you did. Well, but do you agree with that? Do you think fracking should now start? Boris Johnson has really ruled it out. There's been maybe a slight softening by Michael Gove over the last day or so. But do you think it should stay ruled out?
I think it's something we should look at, but we should look at with an independent mind. So I think there are, you know, clearly it's been very successful in America, but they also have very different urban populations.
And the scale is huge there.
So the problem, speaking from a purely personal capacity, the problem for me is that I'm seeing completely different information from both sides. And I want to know the truth. How easily can we get the gas out? How safely can we get the gas out? And how much difference will it make? If we can answer those questions independently and truthfully, then absolutely we should look at it.
Siobhan?
The issue is, in the 21st century, the source of your energy supply is various. So there isn't one solution that answers the whole question. You need various inputs, whether it's green stuff, whether it's fracking, whether it's nuclear. But you cannot do it in a week or a fortnight or a month or a year. This government has been in for 12 years. This problem about our energy supply has been here for every day of those 12 years, and so little is done that we watch our Prime Minister run off to a man who hung 81 people on one day last week.
But we also know that in this circumstance, we have to now go and do that deal. And all I'm saying is that there's a kind of moral distaste about going and talking to unpleasant dictators. And all I'm saying
is why do we have to do it?
Because we have an energy crisis.
But we are currently...
We've identified...
Sorry, Claire, but we are currently selling some of our oil and gas.
I agree that... But
we have options.
There's various options, but partly there has to be a consideration of getting Saudi oil at this point. However, I'm saying that we should look at all of that. But we've got to act urgently. We're again pussyfooting around. This is how we got in the mess in the first place.
Right. I mean, do you think this is a fool's errand, really?
I think there have been failures in energy policy, absolutely, over the past 2 decades.
By this government and other Conservative governments.
Yeah, absolutely. And there have been errors in not investing in nuclear. But Claire's right, we are where we are. And this isn't just about price. Of course, the price of energy is important. It's actually about supply. 44% of all Russian exports is oil. If most countries around the world stop buying Russian export, and I think they're now struggling to find a buyer for 70% of their oil. You've got an immediate issue in global supply of oil. That's what this is about, to try and persuade the OPEC countries to produce more. It is about prices, but more urgently, it's about supply.
Well, I'm ever so sorry, but I don't believe it's that Boris Johnson is off to do a great thing for the world. I think he's worried about energy supply to the UK. He's in trouble because he's done nothing along with his predecessors, and he's trying to sort it out with a guy he should not be sitting down with.
Do we really want to turn this into about Boris Johnson? I mean, no disrespect, but I feel like this is petty, right?
No.
As somebody not associated with either of you, I think that both parties have had atrocious energy policies for decades.
Is it about Boris Johnson? You know, should we be broader, beyond party politics?
If Boris Johnson didn't personalise everything to be about himself, it would be easy to move beyond it.
Emulate him, then.
You know, he talks about how he's on WhatsApp terms with these people. He has been the Prime Minister. The Tory party have been in power for 12 years. We've got a dog's dinner of an energy policy, and now that's been justified to, you know, negotiate with people who execute with impunity. And I don't think anybody watching this show thinks that's acceptable.
And of course, this programme could never happen in Iran, could it? Because we wouldn't be allowed to be here having these opinions and, as women, being on the programme.
We've also just negotiated with Iran in terms of realpolitik.
Right.
Something good came of that. Can we remember, as we're on our high horses, that sometimes you have to talk to unpalatable people.
Can I just move on to something President Zelensky of Ukraine said yesterday? I think he'd said it earlier, but he conceded that Ukraine can never join NATO. Ukraine's refusal to rule out NATO membership had been one of Vladimir Putin's pretexts for Russia's invasion of the country. Is he right? Is this the shape of a negotiated settlement to come, Miriam?
Well, I hope it's a move towards peace, but I think we've got to be clear the basic conditions for any negotiations are, at the very least, a ceasefire and a withdrawal. You know, the Ukrainians can't be expected to negotiate with a gun pointed to their head. But I think Claire made a very interesting point earlier. I'm not saying I completely agree about this disbanding NATO, but at the end of the Cold War, you know, Russia did lose an awful lot in terms of global influence. Now, Putin is an evil man doing evil things, but I do think we need to look further into the future. What is the settlement that we are thinking about long-term with Russia? Putin, obviously, we cannot negotiate with him. He wants a greater Russia. He's an evil dictator who's killing women and children indiscriminately. It's appalling. But we have to look further into the future and think about these wider issues.
Siobhan?
I think it's a statement of fact. They're not a member of NATO. NATO were not about to agree their admission to NATO, and it was an excuse for Putin to go ahead and do it. And on Saturday night, I arranged a community fundraiser for Ukrainian refugees. I think the British people have been absolutely amazing in their support by giving money, by offering to bring families in, and I think that they have shown themselves in their true light at watching a war where Putin has maternity hospitals bombed.
Well, the government, of course, said these are war crimes. Just briefly, in response, perhaps on refugees, but I also want to draw your attention to another story, which is about a Russian tennis player, the current world #1, being asked to renounce Vladimir Putin before being allowed to play at Wimbledon. This was from the Sports Minister, Nigel Huddleston. Do you think that's legitimate, Jo?
I have to say I find it a bit distasteful. I think it's quite a displacement from, you know, you mentioned refugees. I don't think this government is doing enough to ensure safe transport of refugees or for them when they return or get here. And for me, when you look at how Russia treats dissidents, when you look at how courageous people are at the minute who are speaking out against Russia, to use this as something that has to be completed in order to be seen as legitimate, I think it's very easy for somebody in the minister's position to say. So let's talk about the issues that actually will help Russia bring peace, will help Ukraine and get peace, and what we're going to do for people fleeing, rather than, you know, holding a tennis player to account.
Claire?
My concern is that I actually want absolutely to see this war as not just another small war. This is a very major war, and it's of huge world significance. And the reason I'm saying that is because I don't think it can just be like passed to one side. And in a way, what's at stake are things like Western values, like free speech and freedom. right? So to have a government minister respond to the war by mandating speech, because basically this is a version of Black Lives Matter, silence is violence, is a way of saying if you don't denounce and renounce, I mean, you're not allowed to just be a Russian, you have to go on record. I think that's very dangerous. I also, by the way, am very worried about the fact that universities are being told by the universities minister that they've got to deal with academics who are saying the wrong thing on Russia. Now, I might think they're talking rubbish. I might want to argue with them, but I don't want us to compromise on the big Western values in a war that means far more than just a kind of geopolitical skirmish.
Was that a mistake? Was it trivialising it to some
well,
extent?
Had he said those words, and was that headline accurate, then I would agree with Claire. But I did read through the transcript, and actually it was a wider discussion. So he was talking about how when it's team sports, so let's say a football team that's representing Russia, the world has agreed that they can't compete. It is a bit more complicated when you get to individual sports like tennis, and he was saying that they're exploring agreements with international partners of what to do. And one of the things would be to look at whether or not the players supported Putin regime. I completely agree. We shouldn't be compelling speech and forcing a tennis player to denounce Putin, because what does it actually mean anyway? I personally would be in favour of banning Russians from competing in sport, because, yes, it's painful to the athletes and their families, but we need to show Putin that you can't engage in the international community if you behave like this.
We're going to have to leave it there and move on. We're going to talk about cost of living and strikes that are unfolding. Let me just show you this headline in the Daily Express. Bin strikes hit 40-year high, with people told to double bag rubbish and keep it in sheds. The question is, are increases in the cost of living likely to lead to further industrial strife in the near future? Jo, your union is gearing up for its next strike on Monday. Just tell us the justification for that.
So we have a current dispute in higher education, but we've also got a cost of living crisis in further education. In higher education, it is, a 20% pay cut. It is a 35% cut to pensions. It is over 100,000 people on insecure contracts, which can often mean, a fractional contract for 12 weeks. And it is people consistently working both days on a weekend, and 50% of people showing probable signs of depression.
Right. I mean, is it justifiable? Are these strikes justifiable for pay and conditions when inflation is running possibly as high as 8% in the coming months?
I think there are special circumstances with the UCU, because I think you've got quite a big strike fund, haven't you? And that isn't going to be the same for other unions. And should
they be striking?
Well, I think that's a matter for them and their members. Again, we live in a democratic country, and they're entitled to do that. I'm worried for a lot of those students who've had a really bad time over the last few years and who've been treated, both in university and particularly in further education, really, really terribly. So I am worried for them and their education. But are we going to see more strikes?
Yes.
I think often in recession, when life gets really tough, people don't have the confidence to strike because they are just so worried with how to get to the end of the week. Right. I knock on doors every Sunday morning, and the number of people who are now answering the door to tell me that they are worried about their gas and electricity bills, worried about how they're going to fund their families. And these are not people who are at the poorest end. I mean, what we're going to see...
These are people working.
What we're going to see is going to be enormous.
Right. I mean, we are looking, though, at strikes, yes, in higher education, parts of higher education, tube and rail strikes we've had, refuse collection. Do you think we are going to see more industrial strife?
Well, it's possible, because we know that wages aren't keeping up with inflation, and so, of course, that's putting pressure on people's budgets. And, everybody sympathises with that. Everybody's feeling the squeeze. But I think, from the big picture point of view, demanding more wage rises, unfortunately, just pushes up inflation even further. There is no easier answer to this. We are living through a cost of living crisis. And just picking up on what Claire said, I mean, this is going to affect 1 million students. I think 2/3 of universities aren't yet back to face-to-face teaching. These students have spent the vast majority of their university courses without social interaction and yet still paying full fees.
First of all, students have been getting exceptional teaching throughout the pandemic, regardless of it being in the classroom. Second of all, universities in particular are well placed to pay people. This isn't a cost of living crisis with regards to inflation. Universities have over £40 billion of reserves, and they've had over £40 billion of surpluses this year. But to go back to the cost of living crisis, for many people, this isn't new. Inflation is definitely playing a part, but your government, your party, have overseen stagnating pay, the proliferation of insecure work, insufficient patient benefits, energy rises spiralling. So the idea that workers have to absorb this and be the shock absorber of bad economic policies is unacceptable.
Do you accept that there is a global energy crisis, though, that has contributed, obviously, to some of the cost of living pressures, and that the government has unveiled itself £9 billion worth of help? Of course, it's not going to cover all of the increases in energy, just to put it into context.
That is obviously an important context, but for many organisations, they can afford to increase wages. And what happens when strike action happens is often employers have to concede that, and definitely in the part of education, we know the money is there. A minister from the government even said as much when I was on this show 3 weeks ago.
Claire?
I think that to say that students have had an exemplary education during lockdown is...
I said they had excellent teaching.
They had excellent teaching. Many
Are
of
you
my
calling
mates,
that into question?
Yes. Many of my mates who are UCU members, although some have resigned, UCU members are outraged that they were prevented from going to do face-to-face teaching by the union that they were in. They felt that the students were sold out. They were actually in a union that was saying...
That's quite different to excellent teaching online.
Hang on, Jo.
That's quite a smear.
Well, they were the excellent teachers, but they themselves acknowledged that face-to-face is far superior, and they were told not to do that by their own union. So the reason I'm saying that is because a lot of students who should be your allies in this strike...
And they are actually... 73% support the strike.
Actually, many of them are absolutely fed up to the hind teeth of not having an education. So that's a problem. On strikes in general, I think it's... I mean, first of all, you know, I would support anyone going out on strike. The reality is that the cost of lockdowns, apart from anything else, is a major contributive factor. And I warned throughout that there was going to be a price to pay. And I do think that the energy crisis, as we've already discussed, is going to be very hard on people. So I would like to see the government do more. You know, if they could do furlough, they should do more. But it's another problem is I don't think it's necessarily going to take the form of the unions. That was all I was going to add to this. You know, we've seen things like the Gilets jaunes in France. We've seen kind of... the reason I'm mentioning that is because I think that there's great discontent. I'm not sure it will take the form of strike action, but there's a kind of gap between the political class and millions of people who feel alienated, and they just need to feel that this is being taken seriously. They're not just dumped and forgotten.
But you mentioned the Gilets jaunes. Are you saying there will be some sort of unrest then?
I'm saying that there is... I'm saying that there's an atmosphere of disillusion. And we've seen it, you know, with people saying this... I don't necessarily agree, but there should be a referendum on net zero. When you talk... I mean, if you look at Manchester...
That's not going to sort out... That's the next thing that we're going to have.
But let Siobhan respond on this issue. Yeah, but this issue of how people are expressing themselves when it comes to cost of living pressures.
I think another item in your programme might be about, if we've got the time, might be mental health.
Yeah, we're going to talk about it.
This is going to have an extraordinary impact on people's mental health. Mental health services and charities are saying they're getting people in worried and anticipating what their bills are going to say. And I would just say to Miriam that I'm on the Treasury Select Committee, and we had the Governor of the Bank of England in, and we sorted him out about his comment about you can't have your pay increases because that's inflationary. Well, if it's inflationary for people at the bottom, you know, we've got bankers' bonuses back, kind of raging. So I think people throughout, people on low, middle and upper incomes are going to want to make sure that those people who've got money are going to be treated, going to treat it properly, and we're not going to see a return to those kind of bonuses. And I think we need to bring back the £20 uplift in universal credit. I think we need to get rid of VAT on our gas and electricity bills. I think we need a windfall tax on the oil and gas companies in the North Sea who freely admit they've got so much money they don't know what to do with it.
Well, the government has said no to those things. What's your response?
Well, I think there are many things we need to look at. I personally think that changing the taper rate in universal credit is far more progressive than giving the same amount of money to every household, regardless of whether they've got children or not. I think there are some things we need to look at. The cost of net zero is key. Nobody's arguing we shouldn't aim for net zero. Of course we should, but it has to be fair. And I think 23% of people's electricity cost is green levies. I mean, that's a huge amount of money. Could we get rid of it? Could we put it into general taxation? phasing out petrol and diesel cars. We've already priced a lot of young people out of housing ownership. We're now pricing them out of car ownership. Is that just? This is the discussion we need to have.
Well, and it's a discussion we've had many times on this programme. We'll continue to do so. One of the things that could be done, you mentioned, Claire, that the government needs to do more. This headline in the Financial Times, strong public finances raise heat on Sunak, Rishi Sunak, over cost of living crisis. Now, it is said in this report and many others that the Chancellor has got some headroom ahead of the spring statement next week. Would you like to see Rishi Sunak spend that money on more help for people with things like energy bills next week?
I do think there's a case for tax cuts, definitely, because, you know, the biggest cost for a lot of people is the government.
Tax cuts in what form?
National insurance.
Yeah, well, I agree, and I wish we weren't doing that. I mean, I
Right.
have to be honest. But I think, you know, that is probably an argument that has gone. But I do think there's an argument for tax cuts, or at least, you know, moving energy levies and things like that. But we have to be careful about this headroom, because we are still running at a huge deficit. We have pumped an enormous amount of borrowed money into the economy, and we've got to be real about the consequences of that. So we have to be sensible, whilst, of course, taking as much action as possible on the cost of living.
All right, you'd like to see that sort of money being spent to help people pay and deal with their energy bills?
I think, you know, speaking for people watching this programme who there's been a cost of living crisis for a long time, I think asking workers who are already on chronically low pay to pay for this crisis and for their pay to be further degraded. And I think, you know, if we look at during the pandemic, whether it's been a celebrity footballer or a celebrity chef, there have been answers in how we feed children. There have been answers in how we encourage supermarkets to lower food prices. And it just seems that we have a political class with a complete lack of imagination as to how we solve the problems that we have.
But really, genuinely, what we've got to get rid of are ridiculous things like, you know, those zones around Manchester. That was what I was talking about, the Gilets jaunes, you know, when they had the low, high fuel, I can't remember what it's called, the fuel zone thing. There was a rebellion. He had to drop it, right? Because there's additional costs being put on ordinary people. But the other thing is we've got to talk about increasing industrial production. So this levelling up agenda that we hear much about is absolutely irrelevant. I mean, in this instance, I would be going with you in terms of what's happening in further education. We need to get people into jobs, we need training, and that needs to be speeded up as though it was a crisis, as though it was emergency.
Yes.
Yeah, I agree. I think one of the things we need to do is help our manufacturing sector, particularly high energy intensive industries like steel. I've got big steel work in my constituency, and I attended their protest yesterday campaign in Parliament Square asking for the help on energy. You know, we have to support our own homegrown industry, not only for jobs, but also for our security of supply. And that's one thing that we could look at is helping with energy costs, like the Europeans are doing.
All right. Well, Siobhan, you mentioned the issue of mental health. We're going to talk about it. Let me just show you this headline, BBC News. NHS struggling with long tail of pandemic mental ill health. The national insurance contributions going up. The government says will obviously deal, they claim, with much of the backlog. But the analysis of latest NHS data shows the number of referrals for specialist care for mental health has reached a record high by the end of last year. Let's talk to Marjorie Wallace, Chief Executive of mental health charity SANE. Marjorie, what issues are driving this increase in referrals?
Well, they're similar to the physical health. There's been a huge backlog in people being able to get treatment. I mean, we're finding it at our helpline. I mean, people simply can't get treatment. So they reach out for help. They can't see their GPs because the GPs aren't having face-to-face. And actually, it's very difficult for people with severe depression to actually convey that if it's a Zoom or a phone call. There's a lack of consultants. There's a lack of psychologists, counsellors. And what we're finding is that because people are not receiving treatment, people are saying to me that their psychiatric services are literally on their knees. The care teams are denuded, partly because people have been away ill with mental health, partly because of the lack of morale, and partly because we just simply don't have anywhere to take people at risk. And we're looking here at particularly the age group of 16 to 24, what young people. Yes. And there's about 1 million young people not getting help. And these are serious conditions, maybe. We're talking about a threefold increase in referrals and eating disorders, particularly amongst girls, and self-harm and attempted suicides. These are the sort of conditions that are not getting the kind of response that they should be getting in crisis care.
And beyond those particular issues that you've talked about, things like eating disorders, particularly afflicting young women, what are we talking about with the increase in referrals more broadly? Is it anxiety and depression?
Well, the ONS figures, the national statistics figures, say that there has been a doubling of people reporting depression, particularly in certain groups, but literally a doubling of people reporting depression. Now, that's come from all kinds of things. That's come from partly the isolation, partly the families not being able to support each other. And then, as I say, when people are trying to reach out for care, they end up having to go to accident and emergency where they're triaged, and then they're usually just sent home and have to somehow fend for themselves.
Right. And Marjorie, were you seeing these kinds of issues, though, at this sort of scale? I accept it's gone up, probably exponentially because of the pandemic. But were these the kinds of issues you were dealing with before the pandemic that perhaps weren't being looked at properly?
Yes, I mean, we were already very worried about the increases in referrals that were not being met. What's the point, in a way, of identifying children at risk if you've got to wait a year or 18 months to see a counsellor? We were already aware that a lot of people were not getting the kind of safe place they should be when they were at crisis point.
Yes.
We are aware that we were closing the psychiatric beds, which is something that we've always said was a mistake to do, because you can't always look after people in crisis.
Yes.
In the community. So we were worried about it before, but what's happened is that this has sort of all come together, and it's increasing not just the young people, it's the old people who have become more and more isolated, and therefore their depression has deepened.
Okay.
And so by the time we go 2 years later, you've got people much iller than they were.
All right, Marjorie, will you listen to the discussion with the rest of the panel? Money is obviously critically important, because we've heard some of the issues about training, about beds, about counsellors. Do you accept that the government really needs to probably double the amount of money that it's put into mental health services?
Well, we clearly need to increase the resource, and the government's putting 2.3 billion additional a year, I think, into mental health by 2023-24, on the top of 500 million as a response to the pandemic, and having this conversation about it. And those are important things. We have to resource this, but we have to be realistic. We're not going to train up a whole load of new counsellors and therapists overnight, although absolutely we need to start now. But we do need to ask the bigger questions about why. It is much better to prevent these mental health problems than to treat them. And the pandemic is absolutely a driver for this. I mean, if you take away the things that make life worth living, you're going to have people think that life isn't worth living. I mean, I think that's very clear. And we have kept people isolated and alone. And when it comes to children, have been shut in their bedrooms for hours and hours a day on their own. Solitary confinement is a punishment normally for a good reason, because as human beings we need interaction, we need each other. It is utterly unsurprising that children particularly are facing these issues. But of course there were problems before lockdown, and we need to look more widely at things like the cost of living, but also family breakdown, the use of social media. We do have some big questions to answer, but prevention is the answer to this, and that's where we need to be going.
It isn't all about additional money. I mean, if you listen to what Miriam has just said, if we actually deal with the causes, obviously the pandemic is something that...
Causes cost money as well. If I say the biggest driver of mental health problems that I see in my advice surgeries is poor housing. So kids living on top of one another, living in small spaces with no hope of ever getting moved out. I would probably write about maybe 10 letters after a surgery to the child and adolescent mental health services, asking for people to be put up the queue so they can be assessed, so they can get their statements at school, or we can get more medical points on the waiting list. There are many reasons for mental health problems. That housing, as you see it in London, is a really, really significant one that doesn't get spoken about a great deal. I think the closure of the schools during the pandemic has a profound effect, and I think if we ever go through the same thing, we've got to make absolutely sure that we don't close the schools, because this is going to have a generational impact.
Is it about money in the way that we heard Marjorie saying we need to increase the resources, and in fact the panel in general? Or is there something at the heart of society that we're living in that is more anxiety-inducing?
So I think I never want to say that you shouldn't have more resources, but it's just that I could say it about everything all the time. It just seems glib to me. I think that we can't get away from the fact that the lockdown, the collateral damage of lockdown, we can't just walk away from that, by the way, because we're in a European war and forget what we've just done. Because Marjorie made a very important point, which was that people who were ill got worse because basically the NHS didn't treat them, right? And you cannot, and that's what happened. They got locked out. And much of the NHS, well, is returned, but there's parts of it that aren't. People aren't still getting the kind of service they need to get as old normal, as it were. But your point about, your broader point, I think, is all of the things that have been described as adding to mental ill health. The problem I've got with that is they're social problems. And there's been a tendency over some years now to kind of pathologise social problems as individual mental health. I mean, when you say kind of people get depression because of this, I mean, in a way, it sort of makes it it makes it seem as though the problem is theirs. You know, you need to look at them. So I worry as well about young people seeing everything through the prism of trauma. You know, free speech on campus, whenever you're trying to no-platform someone, somebody says, I'll get PTSD if I hear that person speak. You know, that's transphobic and it's going to actually drive me over the edge. Oh. And I think that when you use mental health in that promiscuous way, you distract from what Marjorie's valuable work has done, which is look at hardcore mental health problems, which we need to concentrate on.
Jo.
I think that might have been a distraction from this important conversation, but putting that aside for a second, you know, we have known for centuries now that at times of gross inequality, we see spikes in mental health problems. So notwithstanding, you know, the issue about people living in isolation during lockdown, you know, not enough was done for single people living on their own. We are living with a government that's been in for 12 years, who I understand now are saying they want to start a conversation about mental health. We have 1.5 million people on waiting lists. We have some people dying before they access the help that they need. They have people who present to the NHS probably with quite acute depression or mental health problems that then deteriorate. And I do want to link it back to the cost of living and the industrial issues I was talking about, because half of our members in higher education are showing signs of probable depression. This is linked to overwork, to poverty pay, to feeling that you have limited options. And that was a problem way before the pandemic. And unless we have a change in how we deliver economic and social justice in this country, you can throw money at this problem, but it will continue to be a problem. Marjorie, listening to everything the panel has said, do you want to come back?
Well, as usual, I often agree with Claire, because I think we need to separate out the effects of depression and all the social problems and mental health, and mental illness is what we're dealing with, and what the real worry is the mental illness. And it's not just the resources, I agree with that. It's a cultural thing. It's putting mental illness just as acute as a physical illness, and it's still just the same. If you go with heart pains, you get admitted, you get treatment. If you go saying, I've got suicidal thoughts, you're sent home. And I think we've got to change that kind of attitude, as well as increase the forces. And actually this idea of having a conversation, I mean, we've been talking about it for years, a conversation at the end of this year about mental health strategy. We need to do something now.
Right. I mean, it's interesting having parity. I think former Prime Minister Theresa May talked about it, but then there were criticisms that the money wasn't there to put mental health issues and the way it is treated on a par with physical issues. Do you think there has been a big enough change to bring that?
Well, I think there has, sorry to use the word conversation again, but there has certainly been a change in the conversation.
Haven't we had enough conversation?
And the government is definitely, you know, on track to trying to make a parity of esteem between mental health and physical health. But, you know, I would make the point, again, there is a difference between well-being, as kind of Claire described, and acute mental health problems, and we need to be clear about that. But I thought Siobhan's point about housing is very interesting, because, of course, you know, some of the people group that have been most affected by this are children, and, of course, they have been trapped in houses for a long time. We do have a housing crisis in this problem, but we also need to treat families more fairly. You know, unlike many, many other countries in the world, this is a bit of a niche argument, but we don't recognise families in the tax system, and families face much higher costs than single people in this country, and that is the driver of a lot of child poverty, in my opinion. So I think we need to look much more broadly than just throwing money at it. What are the drivers of these social problems, including housing and tight finances for families, that are changing people's well-being?
25 times more money is spent on cancer research than mental health research.
Right, and you want that to change?
I would like more. I don't want less
No,
for
I
cancer.
know that.
But that gives a stark kind of reality to where we are. You know, we are still at base one in how we deal with many mental health issues. And I just see more and more people coming to my advice surgery, going through counselling services, very good services, but actually their need is greater than that. Their need is medical. Their need is much more profound.
I think we're just going to dip briefly into the chamber, if we can, into the House of Commons. Just for a moment, we can just show you what's going on, obviously filling up because it's the clash of the deputies in a few minutes' time with Dominic Raab for the government and Angela Rayner, the deputy leader of the Labour Party. Jo, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, you know, we've all discussed on this panel what we think are the problems, and I think broadly agreed that we have the capacity, the skills and the infrastructure in this country. You know, further education and adult education is primed to deliver all of the things that you're asking, but we're not getting the investment, and workers are leaving those sectors in droves. So for me, if we want a transition to a green economy, if we want to make sure, you know, that there's activities and education for people to invest their time in, invest in it, but that's not happening.
All right, just before I get more reaction, details of organisations offering information and support with mental health are available at bbc.co.uk/action line, or you can call for free at any time to hear recorded information on 08000 155 998. Responding to what Jo said there.
Of course, you know, a great advert for the sector, perfectly reasonable. I simply think that we have to avoid calling everything a mental health crisis. And one of my concerns about our conversation is that we've been having a conversation in which we say there's a mental health crisis for a long time. I think we need to make much more focused attempts at understanding mental health problems, untangle them from social problems, and say to those people who've got housing problems, who've got job problems, who've got all of these problems, get political and get organised, don't think it's you, and really try and take people out, because I think there's, with young people in particular, a tendency to think they can't cope and to kind of go in on themselves. And that's a different kind of problem that society faces at the moment, of people ending up feeling depressed rather than angry and acting. So I want to just distinguish those things. I used to work in mental health, and we had that argument.
All right, I'm going to have to interrupt. I'm really sorry. Thank you to Marjorie. We're going in for Prime Minister's questions.
I've been asked to reply on behalf of my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister. As the House will know, he's travelling in the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, to discuss energy security, diplomatic action on Russia and Ukraine, and regional issues, including Iran. Mr. Speaker, with your forbearance, may I also say that I understand that 4 members of the Ukrainian Parliament are here with us in the gallery today. And I'm sure I speak for the whole House in saying that we stand in total solidarity with you.
Camelot is one of the largest employers in Watford and for Watford, and its employees have worked tirelessly to successfully run the National Lottery for decades. They play an important role in communities across the UK, many local projects and good causes, including in my constituency. So whilst I obviously declare an interest in the Gambling Commission's decision yesterday not to appoint the licence to Camelot, I do wonder, given the current situation in Ukraine, if my right honourable friend considered it appropriate that the next licensee of the operator of the National Lottery is known to have a joint venture with Gazprom.
Can I thank my honourable friend and just say what an incredible job the National Lottery has done, delivering £45 billion to good causes. He's right, the 4th licence will ensure operator profits are better aligned with returns to good causes. Can I just also say on the specific points he makes, I understand that Alwyn's owner, Mr. Komarak, who's long criticised the Putin regime, is in discussions with the Czech Republic government regarding the joint venture with Gazprom and removing its involvement.
We now come to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I also welcome Ukrainian MPs to this House today. And Mr. Speaker, can I start by wholeheartedly welcoming the positive steps towards returning Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe and Anusha Ashuri to the UK. I'm sure members across the House want to show their support for their families and them. I know the Minister would agree that this devastating situation must never be repeated, and other British nationals still trapped in Iran need to be brought home. So will the Minister commit to a review of these cases to understand what more could have been done by the British Government to secure releases, and whether the lazy comments of the Prime Minister worsened the situation?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I first of all say that I can't yet confirm the reports we've seen in the media, but of course it feels like positive signs, and of course no one wants more than me, but I'm sure all members of the House, to see Nazanin, but also all of the arbitrarily detained nationals reunited with their loved ones. Yeah. I can tell the Honourable Lady, having worked for 2 years with the concerted diplomatic effort led by the Prime Minister, that we have done absolutely everything that we can. She shouldn't give succour to the despotic regime that detained our nationals in Iran or around the world by suggesting it's anyone else's responsibility other than theirs.
Mr. Speaker, it's exactly for that reason that I asked for the review, that it's important to learn from our mistakes so we don't end up with other innocent families facing this ordeal again. So I hope the Minister will consider my comments. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank all of the people who have been working tirelessly to bring British nationals home from Iran, our diplomatic staff and our world-leading British intelligence agencies. The role of the British intelligence today is critical in the face of Putin's aggression. The Deputy Prime Minister oversaw our foreign intelligence services as Foreign Secretary. So can he confirm if at any time he overruled or ignored direct advice from the British security services?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Can I say to the Honourable Lady, what she suggests is nonsense. She's talking about the House of Lords Appointments Commission. They have a vetting process. I have never overruled intelligence advice, and I wouldn't comment on the details of it. What I would say and would agree with her on the strength, the agility of the British diplomatic service, which time and time again are the unsung heroes in returning British nationals, often less celebrated cases than this, but I think now is a great opportunity to recognise the heroic work they do.
Absolutely, I agree with the Minister regarding his comments on their heroic work. The Right Honourable Member was Foreign Secretary on the 17th of March 2020, when British intelligence reportedly warned against the granting of peerage to the Prime Minister's close friend and now Lord Lebedev of Hampton and Siberia. 48 hours later, the Prime Minister visited Lebedev at his home in London. Details of that meeting have never been released. In July 2020, Lebedev's appointment as peer was announced. So can he tell the House what changed between the security warning and the appointment?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Sorry, the Honourable Lady knows full well all individuals nominated for a peerage are done so in recognition of what their contribution is to society. And I should say, that includes those of Russian origin who contribute brilliantly to our nation, many of whom in this country are critics of the Putin regime. Live peerages are vetted by the House of Lords Appointments Commission for matters of probity, and frankly, I think she should know better.
Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, what I do know better is the central duty of any government is to keep the British people safe. There are now widespread reports that the Prime Minister did not accept warnings from our own intelligence services, granting a Russian oligarch, the son and business partner of a KGB spy, a seat here in this Parliament. It shouldn't matter if such a warning was about a close personal friend of the Prime Minister. It shouldn't matter if he gave the Prime Minister thousands of pounds of gifts, and it shouldn't matter how much champagne and caviar he serves. There's no ifs or buts when it comes to the safety of the British people. So I ask the Deputy Prime Minister, can he guarantee that the Prime Minister never asked anyone to urge the security services to revise, reconsider or withdraw their assessment of Lord Lebedev of Hampton and Siberia?
Deputy Prime Minister.
The suggestion she's making is sheer nonsense. But if she wants to talk about national security, then I remind her that she and her shadow cabinet colleagues not so long ago wanted the honourable member for Islington North. Mr. Speaker, a man who wanted and talked about abolishing the army, pulling out of Trident, she voted for that. Has there ever been a more ridiculous, reckless, naive moment to call for unilateral nuclear disarmament and pulling out of NATO? A Labour government would put at risk our security. We're doing everything we can to protect it.
Angela Rayner.
To NATO. And may I remind the Deputy Prime Minister that it was his Prime Minister in 2015 that said he wasn't sure if it was morally irresponsible to work with Putin. So I don't think he's on safe grounds there. Last week, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, said that Britain should never again be at the mercy of a foreign dictatorship for our energy and fuel security. This week, the Prime Minister has gone cap in hand from one dictator to another on a begging mission to the Saudi prince to bail him out. Mr. Speaker, the government have had 12 years to end their reliance on foreign oil and invest in homegrown energy to secure our supplies. Their failure has left us all vulnerable, reliant on another murderous dictator to keep the lights on and pumps open.
I'm going to hear this question. If some people don't want... Somebody want to make a... If you want a little argument, I'm more than happy, because we can argue outside when you're there. But for the moment, I need to get on. I want to hear the question. Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government benches have a choice. They could accept Labour's plan to save working families hundreds of pounds on bills funded with a one-off levy on the soaring profits of big energy companies. So I ask the Deputy Prime Minister, is their only plan to keep on begging?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, can I just gently say to the honourable lady that when she was campaigning, as the rest of them were, to make the honourable member for Islington North Prime Minister, this Prime Minister was Foreign Secretary leading the response to the nerve agent attack.
Hold on. I hate to say it, you can't keep going back for 12 years as a defensive mechanism. What we want to do, I'll decide, thank you. What I want you to do, Deputy Prime Minister, please, if we could try and stick to the general orders. I have a lot of people ahead of me who are desperate to get in without talking about history. How far we want to go back is one thing in passing. Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When she was...
Order. Sir Desmond, he is not responsible for the opposition's policies. This is about the government. This is about questions to the Deputy Prime Minister. I'll put the questions and decide which to write. Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wanted just to point out, and I hope it's not ancient history, that the Prime Minister was, as Foreign Secretary, galvanising the response to the nerve agent attack in Salisbury at the time where the honourable member, the former leader of the Labour Party, was siding with Putin against the UK. What did the honourable lady have to say on Sky News? He's a very strong leader. She can't wait for him to become Prime Minister.
Angela Rayner.
Mr. Speaker, there is a war in Europe. There is a fuel energy crisis in Britain. Democracy is at risk. We must support the courageous efforts of President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people. These uncertain times require leadership with integrity. A leader that works with the security services, can be trusted to say the right thing for British diplomacy and provide security for the British people. Instead, Mr. Speaker, we have this sorry excuse of a government sat before us. They hike tax on 27 million working people while the super rich increase their wealth. They watch energy prices rise by over 50% while the companies enjoy profits they didn't even expect. And they cavort with Russian oligarchs in luxury villas while neglecting the security of the British people. And remember, Mr. Speaker, they partied while the country was in lockdown and were unable to see their dying loved ones. Can the Deputy Prime Minister look the British people in the eye and really say this government is doing their best in their interest?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll tell you what this government, this Prime Minister have done. 1,000 Russian individuals sanctioned, a combined wealth $45 billion. The impact of the sanctions and the diplomatic effort that this Foreign Secretary and this Prime Minister have led, the ruble plummeting, the Russian stock market at record lows, doubled the interest rates. We've also showed, Mr. Speaker, the big-hearted spirit of this government and indeed this nation, with the 5,500 visas granted to Ukrainians to come here, and also the humanitarian route, which has now got 100,000 sponsors applying to come to take Ukrainian families in these homes. While she's in her social media echo chamber, that's what this government is doing.
It was very good to see my right honourable friend visit the International Criminal Court earlier this week, but they have enduring difficulties with funding. Last year they had a $40 million shortfall in their budget because some participating states failed to meet their annual contribution. The International Criminal Court is only as good as the sum of its parts, so what steps can the government take to secure contingency funding to ensure that one day Russian military commanders in Ukraine can expect to stand trial for war crimes?
And honourable friends, bang on. The Assembly of States Party is looking at the arrears. I was in The Hague on Monday speaking to the prosecutor and the President of the Court. We will be coming forward with a voluntary package of financial and technical support because now, as they look at the situation in Ukraine, we want, and I think the whole House would want, Putin and his commanders to know if they continue with war crimes in Ukraine, they'll end up not just in the dock of a court, but behind bars.
We now come to the Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I welcome our 4 colleagues from the Parliament of Ukraine who are with us today? We all stand with them. Mr. Speaker, I've spent much of the last week trying to help the Scottish charity Dnipro Kids, established by fans of Hibernian Football Club, who've evacuated 48 children from orphanages in Ukraine and are desperately attempting to provide them with temporary sanctuary in Scotland. Mr. Speaker, there is a plane ready and waiting in Poland to bring these orphans to the UK on Friday, but that flight will leave empty without the necessary paperwork from the Home Office. The Polish authorities, Edinburgh City Council, the Scottish Government and the orphans' guardians are all working to bring these children to safety. I've worked with UK Government ministers to try and make this happen, and I want to commend Lord Harrington in particular for his efforts. But a week on, the Home Office is still proving to be the only obstacle in the way, and it risks leaving these children stranded. So I'm pleading with the Deputy Prime Minister, remove these obstructions before it's too late. Will he work with me and the Ukrainian authorities to guarantee that these 48 Ukrainian orphans will get on that plane this Friday?
Hear, hear. Deputy Prime Minister.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman for all he's doing? This is a heart-rending situation. We want to do everything we can. Of course, there are a range of issues in this case, including the wishes of the Ukrainian government on where orphan children should go and should be living, whether any necessary permissions have been sought from the Ukrainian and/or Polish governments. This isn't actually about bureaucracy, it's about genuine safeguarding issues, but I certainly want to work with him in the best interests of those children.
Ian Blackford.
I'm asking the government to do just exactly that, because we've been working with the Ukrainian and Polish authorities. We have their support. We need the Home Office to give us the paperwork that will make that happen. Because, Mr. Speaker, this one case goes to the heart of the failure in the UK government's response to the biggest refugee crisis in Europe since World War II. It is deeply concerning that it's taken the intervention of several ministers of state, letters to multiple European ambassadors, and the fear of this case being exposed in the chamber to try and force movement in an urgent case involving almost 50 vulnerable children. Even where there is the will, it seems that simply there is no way that the Home Office can get involved. I shouldn't have been sending letters to the authorities in Ukraine and Poland. The Home Office should have been doing it. If all these powerful people can't make it happen, what hope do all the other children fleeing this awful war have of finding sanctuary in the UK? The United Nations are now estimating that almost 1 child a second is becoming a refugee from the war in Ukraine. These 48 children will not be the last who need sanctuary and safety. Surely the Deputy Prime Minister agrees it shouldn't have taken this level of intervention and pressure for the Home Office to do the right thing by these children.
Minister.
Well, can I just say to him, it's very important that the proper international practices on safeguarding are followed. I know he appreciates that. We're keen to find out if family reunion options with Ukrainian family in the region have been considered. We also know, can you just listen for a second, because it's important. We also know that many children in state care in Ukraine have family members in the region for safeguarding and well-being of the children. That must also be considered. More broadly, he raises the issue about refugees and children. On top of the measures that I've already mentioned, we're making plans for the arrival of 100,000 Ukrainian children through the Education Secretary in our schools. And I pay tribute to the Health Secretary for bringing Ukrainian children suffering from cancer over to this country to receive the vital treatment they need.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. British servicemen and women have served under Operations Kibrit and Orbital since 2015, working with the Ukrainian armed forces and helping to shore up the eastern flank of NATO, which is now more important than ever. Would the Deputy Prime Minister join with me in putting on the record the gratitude of this House and consider what recognition we can give them for their service and for their role in history?
Deputy Prime Minister.
She's absolutely right. She's totally right to pay tribute to the professionalism, the dedication, the sacrifice of our armed service men and women every day to defend this country. She'll know that recognition for all military operations is kept under continuous review, and I know that the Defence Secretary will have heard her very compelling suggestions.
Stephen Farr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I first of all wish you and the entire House an early happy St Patrick's Day? Now, there was a 3.1% increase to universal credit and other benefits set by the government last September, but inflation is now pushing 7%. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Trussell Trust and many other organisations have highlighted the real jeopardy that millions of people are now facing from a real terms cut in the level of benefits, and other measures from the government simply don't compensate for that. So surely it's not tenable for the government to stick so rigorously to a decision taken 6 months ago, whenever circumstances have changed so radically since then.
Prime Minister.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? He's right about the cost of living challenge, not least with the war in Ukraine. The government and the Chancellor have already put in place a £20 billion package across this year, £9 billion to help with energy bills, the rest to deal with the wider cost of living issues. That includes raising the national living wage. On UC that he mentions, we're giving nearly 2 million families an extra £1,000 a year. The Kickstart scheme, increasing the personal tax threshold by over 50% since 2010. We're doing everything we can, and of course we'll keep the cost of living issues under constant and regular review.
Gareth Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With multinationals scaling back Russian operations and local businesses stepping forward with offers of jobs and equipment, once again, British businesses are responding at a time of great challenge. Will the Deputy Prime Minister join me in thanking all those businesses across Lincolnshire who have offered support? And can he outline how the government may be able to connect those offers of support with the Ukrainians in most need?
Deputy Prime Minister.
Can I thank my honourable friend, and I do join him in thanking all those businesses, but also all the charities and the individual families up and down the country who have shown the big-hearted traditions that make this country so great. He will be aware, of course, of the new sponsorship scheme. We've had overall 100,000 sponsors apply. And, of course, working with businesses is particularly valuable because we know that there's huge value, not just in terms of allowing those that come here to get access to work, but it also helps them to integrate into our society as confident members of our community.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Deputy Prime Minister will agree with me that when it comes to judging a person, it's often done by the company that they keep. When it comes to tennis, the Prime Minister enjoys the company of and backhanders of Lyubov Chernikin. When it came to celebrating the election victory, the Prime Minister prioritised the party hosted by the former KGB agent Alexander Lebedev. He has a great many others, such as Viktor Fedotov and Alex Temerko as friends. Can he therefore tell us what first attracted the Prime Minister to the billionaire Russian oligarchs?
Mr. Prime Minister.
I wasn't quite sure where he was going at the beginning of his question, but what I can tell him, of course, the Prime Minister is not just a very social individual. He wants his country to be open, outward-looking to the world. But we were the government, and he was the Prime Minister, and I was the Foreign Secretary, that introduced the Sergei Magnitsky sanctions that put human rights sanctions, asset freeze and visa bans, not just on Russians where we have evidence of wrongdoing, but also the murderers of Khashoggi, also the persecutors of the Myanmar minority and many others. It was this government, not the Labour Party.
Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The eyes of the world are rightly focused on Putin's evil invasion of Ukraine. But there is still a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. And I welcome the fact that the UK government is hosting a pledging conference later this month for that crisis. And can my right honourable friend ensure that we also keep education for those poor children on the agenda?
Deputy Prime Minister.
She's absolutely right, and we will keep the focus on Afghanistan and the many other conflicts around the world that need our support. I can tell her that that particular conference will provide specifically support for access to girls' education, a long-standing priority of the Prime Minister. And I would also just point out that we've doubled our humanitarian aid to Afghanistan for the financial year to £286 million.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Appeasing murderous despots is never going to be the route to security of energy supply. So wouldn't it make more sense for the Prime Minister to be here talking to UK energy industries? Shouldn't he be talking to renewable energy developers about what they can do to bring their product on stream faster and quicker? And shouldn't he also be speaking to our own offshore oil and gas industry about what they can do in the here and now to improve security of supply and to assist in the journey towards net zero?
Yes, he was doing that on Monday evening, I can tell the honourable gentleman. And now it's Wednesday, and yes, he's out in Saudi Arabia, closing a £1 billion investment deal, creating 700 jobs in the north in renewable energy. I think the Lib Dems need to keep up.
Duncan Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. North Norfolk is a rural constituency, and many residents rely on their car to get around, and they heat their homes by using heating oil. The price of crude oil may have come down in the last few days, but the petrol pumps are still going up, and I've had constituents who are quoted £2 a litre for heating oil. This not only affects working families, but pensioners in rural areas who are on a fixed income. Can I ask that the Deputy Prime Minister does everything he can to make sure that in the spring statement we address these problems for really, really rural constituencies that are getting the double whammy of these crippling costs?
Deputy Prime Minister.
My honourable friend's absolutely right. He knows that we have got a £20 billion package this year dealing with the cost of living, £9 billion of it focused on energy prices. The issues that he talks about for his constituency, but I think up and down the country, are I think, very well made, and I know the Chancellor will have heard his suggestions.
Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is visiting Saudi Arabia, and as usual, we are told there will be frank, private discussions with the Saudis on their human rights record. But in the light of the state murder of Jamal Khashoggi, in the light of the brutal executions of 81 men at the weekend, why does the Deputy Prime Minister think that the UK's representations on human rights are so ineffective, and what more will we do to make the Saudis behave ethically?
Prime Minister.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? Can I just say to him, when I was Foreign Secretary and I went to Riyadh twice, and I know the Prime Minister will be raising these issues again, we talked about the women's rights defenders. He says we've been ineffective. They've all been released. We talked about Rauf Badawi, the author and critic. He was recently released. He mentions Jamal Khashoggi. We applied, I think we're one of the first to apply, asset freeze and visa bans on those responsible for his murder. So we are an outward, an international country. That is what Britain's role is in the 21st century. But we will never allow our moral red lines to be blurred.
Tom Hunt.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Rousseau once said about the Polish people, "You may swallow the pole, but you will never digest them." I think that powerful quote says so much for how the Polish people have stood up robustly and strongly against aggression over the years, and also about their steadfast support right now for their close and dear allies, the Ukrainian people. In Ipswich, we've had 3 lorries going from Ipswich to Lviv in support of the Ukrainian people. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline the steps the government will take to support our close allies Poland as they take an unprecedented numbers of refugees, and of course, whilst they have their own security concerns in relation to Russia?
Deputy Prime Minister.
He's absolutely right, and I pay tribute to not just his constituents, but the Polish community in particular, and of course for their big-hearted support for the people of Ukraine. And of course, as a leading donor, I think the second largest donor to Ukraine, we've committed a further £174 million in aid, bring our total to £400 million. But that will also support those countries in the close proximity to Ukraine, their neighbours, and first and foremost will be Poland.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the 28th of April 2018, when he was Foreign Secretary, the Prime Minister is reported to have attended a party at a castle in Italy where he met a former KGB officer. Now, this was just weeks after the Salisbury poisonings and immediately after he attended a NATO summit on Russia. If that is not astonishing enough in itself, it is also reported he travelled there without any security detail or officials present. So will there now be an investigation into what sounds like a complete failure of national security?
Prime Minister.
He's talking total nonsense, and I don't have anything to add to what I've already said.
In addition to my constituents' concerns for Ukraine, they're also concerned about planning policy. I wrote to the Prime Minister in October 2019 about the threat to the Goring Gap. It's against government policy, it's against public interest for every greenfield that's a strategic gap to be built on, and inspectors made a decision which would wipe away the planning powers of every local council in the country. Can I ask if the Prime Minister will see me and if the government will revoke this inspector's mistaken decision?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? Can I also, I empathise as someone with a massive proportion of Green Belt in my constituency on the frustrations I think honourable members across the House feel with some planning decisions that are made. However, once a planning decision is final, it can't be challenged unless it's successfully challenged in the courts.
Stephanie Peacock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year, 255 children and young people were admitted to Barnsley Hospital for self-harm. That is 15 times the national average. This is a public health crisis. So will the Deputy Prime Minister ask the Health Secretary to meet with me and healthcare providers from Barnsley to immediately respond to this mental health crisis?
We've put a huge amount into both mental health and wider the NHS budget, not just on COVID, but to respond to the wider issues. I will certainly make sure in relation to the specific issue that she raises that an appropriate health minister will see her.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
Are any oligarchs with UK passports on our sanctions list?
Can I thank the chair of the ISC? I think I would have to let the Foreign Secretary and the Foreign Office check carefully and respond to him in due course.
Stephen Timms.
Thank you,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 3 weeks ago, the chair of the UK Statistics Authority, Sir David Norgrove, wrote to the Prime Minister to point out that his repeated assertion that employment is now higher than it was before the pandemic is incorrect. Yesterday's employment statistics show 840,000 fewer self-employed people now than before the pandemic, and that overall employment is 580,000 lower. Does the Deputy Prime Minister agree that truthfulness is vital to trust in our democracy? Does he accept the correction from Sir David Norgrove?
Look, of course, we listen very carefully to David. But what I would say to the honourable gentleman is actually he points to the data yesterday. It showed that unemployment has fallen below 4%, is back at pre-pandemic levels, and is being termed a remarkable success from everyone to the Resolution Foundation. He talks about the truth. There's one golden truth, and that is whenever there is a Labour government in the past, unemployment has always been higher when they left office when they started. Mr. Speaker, that's the jobs guarantee you get with Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have now provided more than 3,000 anti-tank weapons, training and other military support to Ukraine, alongside crushing financial sanctions on Russia and more bilateral assistance, humanitarian assistance aid than any other country. But can my right honourable friend confirm that we will continue to deliver further military aid and support, and with that we will supply the Starstreak anti-aircraft missiles necessary to destroy Russian jets?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. We've delivered over 3,600 anti-tank missiles weapons. We'll also be sending a consignment of the Javelin anti-tank missiles, and we are indeed, as he says, exploring the donation of Starstreak anti-air missiles.
Dan Carden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's welcome that Ukrainians seeking asylum in Britain will have the right to work and access to public services. We should always offer sanctuary to those fleeing persecution. People who come to Britain to make it their home, no matter where they're from or the colour of their skin, make a hugely positive contribution to our society and economy, if they're supported to do so. So how can the government now justify not extending the same welcome and the same rights, including the right to work, to all people seeking asylum in Britain?
Deputy Prime Minister.
He's right that we have a strong tradition, and we've shown we've stepped up to the plate with the Hong Kong British National Overseas Citizens, with Operation Pitting, which brought 17,000 back, and we will go further and beyond the normal rules when there is a crisis, as we've seen in Ukraine. He's absolutely right about what he said in relation to the current scheme. Those coming here, the Ukrainians can live, work and access benefits. They can stay for 3 years with leave to remain, and I'm proud, and the whole House should be proud, not just of the big-hearted approach of this government, but also the 100,000 British sponsors who have come forward and said they will open their homes to those refugees.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Mr. Speaker, can I ask my right honourable friend that as the brilliant Ukrainian people fight and die on a daily basis for their rights of freedom and democracy, it's important, therefore, that we make something very clear, and I wonder if he would do this. They have asked for membership of NATO for a significant period of time, and NATO has chosen not to give it to them. My concern now is no matter what they decide, it remains their absolute right as a free nation and a free people to make such an application in the future, and, noticing that Finland is talking about being a member, that we treat them in exactly the same way as we would an application from Finland.
Well, can I thank my right honourable friend? And he will have heard what President Zelensky has said overnight in relation to this. But one of the things that we've always been crystal clear as a government is that if there is a diplomatic off-ramp, and I have to say we have a heavy measure of scepticism about whether Putin could ever fulfil such a deal, but if there is, it has to be done with the will and the volition of the Ukrainian president and the Ukrainian people.
We now come to Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent is a popular parish priest in Glasgow. Originally from Nigeria, he became a British citizen last year and applied for his first British passport last summer. On his naturalisation certificate issued by the Home Secretary, It includes his title, Reverend Father, under his name. This is causing the Passport Office unexplained difficulties, and 7 months on, he's still waiting for his passport. Can I ask the Deputy Prime Minister to look at this case as a matter of urgency? His mother is extremely ill in Nigeria. He needs to get his passport to visit her.
Deputy Prime Minister.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for raising that case? It sounds very sensitive. I will make sure a Home Office Minister looks at it as a matter of urgency.
And that brings us to the end of this session of Prime Minister's Questions. It was with the Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab and Labour's Deputy Leader Angela Rayner. She opened the session, unsurprisingly, warmly welcoming the news, according to Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe's MP here, that she is on her way home after nearly 6 years of detention. In response, Dominic Raab said he wouldn't comment any further for the moment, but if we have any more developments on, obviously, that incredibly important story, we will bring them to you. Let me introduce our guest for this part of the programme. For the Government, Industry Minister Lee Rowley, Shadow Minister for Employment for Labour Alison McGovern, and Nick Eardley, my colleague, political correspondent for the BBC. Welcome to all of you. Now, Angela Rayner then opened her questions, grilling the Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab on why a peerage was given to Russian businessman Evgeny Lebedev, Lord Lebedev, despite reports, she said, of a British intelligence warning against it. Just give us some of the background to this, Nick.
Well, this has been rolling on over the last few days after various reports in the Sunday Times and elsewhere about the Prime Minister's involvement, his specific involvement in getting Evgeny Lebedev a peerage back in 2020. Now, the Prime Minister said he didn't overrule concerns from the security services, but there have always been accusations and questions over whether he lent on some of that process. And of course, if the Prime Minister makes a recommendation to the Queen, it's not up to the House of Lords Appointments Committee to come back and say, we're going to overrule the monarch. So there's that. And then we also heard repeated questions at PMQs there about money that's been donated to the Conservative Party from Russian-linked figures, which has been coming up time and again in the context of the crackdown on Russian interests in this country.
I mean, Lee, did the Prime Minister, or are you assured that he didn't, ask the security services to revise their assessment of Evgeny Lebedev when he was given that peerage? Dominic Raab, during that session, said the suggestion was nonsense. Those were his words, but he didn't explicitly say the Prime Minister didn't do that.
Well, there's a process which follows in terms of nomination to the House of Lords, and that process has been followed in this individual's instance as in every other. I wasn't there. I don't have the detail.
No, absolutely. But are you assured? Do you think you would want assurances?
I would just really caution Angela Rayner in terms of there was I think the tone was really wrong there, and there's a lot of reliance upon innuendo and inference, bringing in some very, very, very sensitive areas like the security services in order to make a political point. And I'm just not sure that's the right way to go in the middle of a war.
I'm sure Lee didn't mean to warn the female deputy leader of the Labour Party about her tone. I think that
with being female, and it's nothing to do with being female. It's about the appropriateness of questions like that.
Labour women at the dispatch box are constantly told by government ministers to mind their tone, and we just need it to stop, because the undertone of that comment is not OK, that somehow women speak in the wrong way. But let's come back to... The
let him respond and then you'll come back to it.
The undertone of my comment, I would say exactly the same thing if Keir Starmer was there or anybody else was there. It is absolutely nothing to do with gender, sexuality, background, race or anything else. It's about the appropriateness of comments in the middle of an extremely sensitive global situation to start playing with innuendo and inference in order to make a political point so people can get on the news.
Answer that specifically.
Well, I'm saying that Labour women at the dispatch box don't like being told to mind their tone.
But
anyway,
is it appropriate? Is it appropriate to be asking particularly about this individual in the way that Angela Rayner did in the middle of a war?
Yes, it is, because unfortunately the Prime Minister's got form in this regard. He overruled his ethics advisor, who then resigned over problems in Downing Street. He doesn't take the advice that he should take. We know, whether it is the conduct of his ministers or this issue, it is absolutely appropriate.
So you're using past behaviour of the Prime Minister to say categorically that Labour Party has evidence that he did overrule here the appointments process of Evgeny Lebedev.
It's right to ask the questions because, again, past form with the Prime Minister says that we have to challenge and challenge and challenge in order to get him to be upfront about what has happened. And of course, people are going to ask questions about this situation and this peerage, given what has happened. So I think it's absolutely right for us to say to the Prime Minister, just be upfront.
Right. What do you say in response to that, Lee?
It's for people to choose what questions they want to ask. But ultimately, we can draw conclusions about both the choice of those questions and the way and the time that they choose to ask them, about the seriousness by which they approach some extremely serious issues globally.
Can we just say Evgeny Lebedev is not on the sanctioned list, and he has spoken out against the war.
Against the war in Ukraine. He's also said he's not a security risk. The question's always been around his dad, who made a lot of money in the Soviet Union, after the fall of the Soviet Union, I should say, and is a former KGB agent, although Evgeny, Lord Lebedev, has said he's not a security risk. Can I just ask you, what is it that made the Prime Minister nominate Evgeny Lebedev for a peerage? What does he bring to the House of Lords?
Well, there are a substantial number of people going to the House of Lords. I mean, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people for very different reasons. Evgeny Lebedev, who I don't know, who I've never met, has a long record of charitable giving within the country. He is somebody of substance in London and in the UK as a whole. We should welcome people irrespective of background. So long as it's appropriate to do so, we should welcome them into our public life.
I get that you're not involved in this process, but you are, of course, a former deputy chairman of the Conservative Party. We're always told that the accusations of Russian-linked money when the Conservative Party, major donors who have links to Russia, that money is vetted, that these people are vetted. What is the process for making sure that money isn't linked to some wrongdoing in Russia?
There's long-standing processes both in the Conservative Party and all parties to assess the appropriateness of them, and ultimately they have to go via what the government and what the law says. They're all declared in the appropriate way. They're all with the Electoral Commission and the like. And we just have to be really careful about this. I get that there is quite rightly scrutiny and interest on this, but ultimately, unless we go to a process of state-funded parties, which I don't think would be would be something that would be supported in my constituency or others, then we have to accept that people have the right to donate so long as it is legal for them to do so.
I'm just wondering what the vetting process is, because no one's ever explained that.
Well, as I say, the process, there's long-standing units which look at these things in multiple different ways, and then ultimately, so long as the law is followed, so long as it's appropriate to do so, people are able to give donations to either the Conservative Party, Labour, Lib Dems or whomever.
What are you calling for, Alison, beyond the questioning? What are you calling for?
I think, like in so many of these issues, the Prime Minister should just be upfront and answer the questions.
Well, of course, he says he has answered them. So beyond that, what else would Labour like to hear?
In relation to the issue as a whole, I think this is not a new thing. I was struck this week by some of my colleagues, Chris Bryant, Ben Bradshaw, Liam Byrne and others. Deputy Prime Minister mentioned the Magnitsky arrangements,
yes.
And they were going at this issue month after month and really didn't get a lot of support from the government. And now I think perhaps we need to really grasp this issue, and we should have in Parliament. We should have listened to those people, and I think that we can go further. If you look at the ISC report,
the Intelligence and Security Committee, yeah.
Forgive me, yes, using an acronym there. If you look at that report, I think that could have been grasped by the government for a long time.
Do you regret that the action and some of the laws that were already in place, I mean, the government says it has this extensive list of sanctions now, and there may be more in the pipeline, to coin a phrase, but do you accept that actually the government has been caught off guard on this by not actually implementing some of the already existing legislation when it comes to sanctioning individuals and companies?
I'm not sure I do. I think it is very challenging and delicate situation about how to do this within foreign affairs and all the rest of it. But you've seen in the last 3 weeks alone a huge and very rapid movement towards highlighting the unacceptability of what's happening in Russia and those people who are connected to them. And as the Deputy Prime Minister, as Dominic Raab outlined in PMQs, there is clear evidence previously of where the government has intervened, where it's proportionate to do so.
Right, let's talk about refugees. It was, in fact, Ian Blackford that raised a specific issue, the leader of the SNP at Westminster, a specific issue about 48 Ukrainian orphans, and he wants to guarantee their safe passage to the UK. He is blaming and has blamed the Home Office for asking and demanding more paperwork. Has there been too much bureaucracy in the schemes that have been set up by the government?
Well, I don't know the individual case, and I hope that it's resolved really quickly, because it sounds from what we listened to a moment ago that if there is a way to help and assist, that we should try and do that, and Dominic Raab indicated that. We are still less than 3 weeks in to the first invasion on European soil in 70 years. And yes, we were able to prepare, and we've done so. But I think our response in those 3 weeks, which is, moving 5,000 people with visas already, with 100,000 plus people who have registered for the scheme, all of the support that's gone in on the ground, both within Poland and locally, nothing is perfect in this world, and I'm not suggesting it is, but I think it's a real and substantive and serious response.
But anyone who was involved with the situation with Syrian refugees, or even, just recently in relation to Afghanistan, had exactly the same problems. That government minister gets up in the House of Commons, says this is a system, it will all work brilliantly. And the truth is, it doesn't. And the Home Office fails time and again to actually make real that ambition that the British public quite rightly have to be generous and to welcome people who really need us. So I'm sort of at a loss, really, to understand why the Tories have failed to deal with the problems in the Home Office. Whether it's making sure that we had the right number of people in the right place, whether the processes happen in a smooth way. It seems like we're stuck going round and round and round this roundabout where people publicly say, we want to help, we believe in our responsibilities towards refugees, and the Home Office is simply incapable of dealing with it.
We're not stuck. We have thousands and thousands of people who have visas. We have a scheme which is going to bring 100, substantial numbers of people, tens of thousands of people here. Where there are things in government which need unblocking, where there are things which could be made better, I absolutely agree with you. We should do that. But I just don't think it is reasonable to make the argument that the government in 3 weeks, less than 21 days, hasn't moved quickly and substantively and seriously on the biggest issue of our time.
Anyone who had anything to do with supporting people who were coming from Syria could have told you that this would happen. And that's a situation that has been going on for year after year after year. So it's not about the last 3 weeks. It's about the past decade, where our country has said, the British public have said, we believe in our responsibilities, that when people need us, we're there for them. And the Home Office won't make that happen in a way that makes real that ambition for us to play our part when this stuff happens.
But that's not correct, though, is it? We are seeing just in a few days how we have moved the entirety of government, the entire mechanisms of government towards the UK. We have 100,000 plus people coming from Hong Kong. We have done lots of stuff on Afghanistan. This is an indication each time. I'm not suggesting it's perfect, Alison, but I do.
Listen to Syrians is what I would say.
Listen
to people in this country who had to deal with.
Well, let me just get a bit of context. There are two issues here. There is, of course, the scheme at hand, and the Foreign Secretary earlier today says that next week the UK is expecting to welcome refugees who are going to go into the homes of people in the UK. They will have been matched up together. That's going to start next week. Alison is raising also the bigger issue of the Home Office itself, and whether it is, to coin an old Labour Home Secretary, John Reid, fit for purpose. And these two things still are under scrutiny, aren't they?
They are, and it's worth pointing out that the person overseeing the process by which people can come and stay in someone's house is Michael Gove, who is from a completely different department.
Yeah, from the Levelling Up department.
Not from the Home Office. Look, I mean, you're absolutely right. There have been questions over the way the Home Office has been able to deal with these massive crises for years. They happened in Afghanistan. They've happened again with Ukraine. There are Conservative MPs who are unhappy. There are some Conservative ministers who are unhappy with the way the Home Office operates. And I suspect that those questions aren't going to go away, and some of them will lead back to the Home Secretary's door,
right? Because
she is ultimately the person who oversees this.
Let's look at some of the practicalities of this. 122,000 expressions of interest so far from Ukrainians. Councils are going to be in charge of the vetting process to make sure the accommodation is suitable. £10,000 per refugee. Is that enough in your mind, Alison?
Better than nothing.
Right. So you support that whole scheme and the way it's been set up. I take your point that you think it's been delayed and they should have expected it, but the actual practical rolling out, you're happy with?
I would not describe myself as happy. I would say that Michael Gove and Priti Patel could do more to engage with local authorities. It's almost sometimes as if the Tories in government forget that local government exists. You know, whether that is times in the pandemic where that connection just wasn't there. Now, over this, we need, you know, not just for people to be welcomed and the accommodation to be good, but also to make sure that all of the other things that will help those communities be strong and support those people are there. So I would say to the government, you need to do more to work in lockstep with local authorities, because that disconnect is really what will stop this from working.
Lee, do you think the number of refugees that can apply for homes for Ukraine should be limitless?
I don't think we should get focused on numbers. I think we should be clear that there is a real and obvious and urgent issue in Ukraine. A lot of those people who are moving either within Ukraine or from Ukraine will want to stay relatively close to Ukraine. Where we can be, we should be generous. We should have processes around that, which has been one of the reasons for taking a few days to get these things going. But ultimately, I think focuses on numbers don't actually do justice to both the importance and the severity of this issue and about the warm-heartedness and generosity of the country.
And do you still support the visa aspect of this scheme?
The issue isn't visa, the issue is speed.
Well, visas were said to be the critical issue because many EU countries had waived visas, but you're not asking for that.
If somebody has, you know, they've got biometric passport, they can get the process underway quickly, that is the system we're looking for. There is not the problem, you know, and this has been going on for years and years and years, that people are left without a response from the Home Office for far too long. All of the time targets that the Home Office sets itself are kind of meaningless. And this is being represented in this problem now. So I think the issue is dealing with the bureaucracy and speeding it up, and that's what we need.
If you take the example that just came up at Prime Minister's Questions, it's the Dnipro Kids Appeal. It's an Edinburgh-based charity who've worked with Ukrainian orphans for years. They would say it's not easy to get all those details for 48 orphans who've had to flee the country extremely quickly. So if you're going through what can be quite a laborious visa process, that's going to take a lot of time for these kids. So in that sort of situation, is there not quite a good argument to waive it?
No, you're right. The problem is the process and the speed not being there. And, you know, we've clearly got an experienced organisation there who should be supported as much as...
Do they need visas?
The issue is, you know, if somebody turns up or in this example, we know that there's a group of people there and we've gone through the checks, the issue is not the visa itself, it's getting the bureaucracy done. And that is my frustration here, is that inability to get the bureaucracy working properly has been a consistent problem over the past decade with the Home Office. And we always come to this point where Tory MPs say, oh, but, you know, all of this has happened out of the blue. Well, it hasn't, has it? Because the Home Office have been like this for the past decade.
All right.
And it's got to change.
Well, you mentioned the situation with Afghans here in the UK. There are 12,000 Afghan refugees still in hotels, months after they were brought here to escape the Taliban and the fall of Kabul. Should the government extend this housing scheme that's been set up for Ukrainians to them?
There's a substantial amount of work going on around those who have come in through Operation Pitting, quite rightly so. They've come from very different circumstances, different times. We need to make sure that they're able to thrive in the UK, that people who come from via Operation Pitting are likely to build their new lives here, whereas many people who are coming from the Ukraine may in the future want to go back as and when we all hope it's safe to do so. So I think it's a different, and quite rightly it's a different thing, because we have to try and cut our cloth in the way that's appropriate for the individual circumstances. So Pitting versus Ukraine, I think, probably looks at...
I mean, the figures, we did them on the programme, actually, a little while ago, Home Office, keeping Afghans in hotels costing taxpayers £1.2 million a day.
I felt that the announcement by Michael Gove was kind of an admission of failure, really. Whatever my hesitations about whether or not the system will be delivered well, given the disconnect between government and local government and all of that, it did feel like the government was saying, actually, you know, the existing system has failed. So I think that we've got to, you know, watch closely what happens here, see if we can improve the system as a whole.
But would you like to see it expanded then in the same way?
If this is the beginning of a new policy, then I think we should definitely look at that. But the devil is in the detail with all of this. If it can't be made to work on the ground, given the record of the Home Office, then that worries me. But I live in hope, Jo, that we will finally make it better.
Lee?
Well, I just think we have to be a little bit careful about the issues in front of us. You know, this is an emergency situation with large numbers of people moving within a matter of days. And the idea that the government, that any system under any government of any colour could have several 100,000 hotel rooms on tap for when they need.
I mean, the Afghan situation was an emergency too, of course.
And we've responded to that emergency. And 20,000, greatest airlift of people out of an area since 1945.
How many got left behind?
Huge support going in to try and sort that. But we just have to be careful. You know, the country is doing well in terms of trying to solve some of these really intractable, difficult and emergency issues. Not perfectly, but well. And I hope that across the political spectrum we can acknowledge that and then try and work on the things where we need to improve too.
All right, I don't think we've got time for much more, except to say that the scheme will probably be underway fully when those refugees start to arrive next week.
Yes.
Right, that's it. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me today. We will be back tomorrow at 12:15 with Politics Live. Of course, we will be keeping across all the developments to do with Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe, either this afternoon on BBC News or, of course, we'll bring it to you tomorrow on Politics Live. But from all of us here, have a very good afternoon. Bye-bye.